Well, when we think about the exegetical foundations for apologetics, there are so many scriptures that come to mind, especially for a presuppositional approach. But one of the pillar texts that has been really sort of constraining my attention here lately has been Colossians chapter 2. Now, a lot of people go to Romans chapter 1 to try to prove that, or you'll go to something like Psalm 14 where it talks about the fool has said in his heart there is no God, or you'll go to the Proverbs where it says, that the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge and things like that, or the two-step approach in Proverbs where you don't answer a fool according to his folly because you'll be like him. You respond to a fool according to his folly so that he can see his own folly, or lest he becomes wise in his own eyes. There are so many texts, in other words, that speak to this, and there's numerous other ones that I didn't even list there. But Colossians chapter 2 is a comprehensive approach to what do you do when you're confronted with a philosophy, with a worldview, with an idea, with a doctrine that is not Christian. And the Apostle Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, he speaks about a philosophy that is not, and then he uses a prepositional phrase here, kata Christou, not according to Christ. And if it's not in accordance with Christ, that just simply means it is not in keeping with the Christian worldview. It's not in keeping with the mind of Christ, and it's not in keeping with who the Apostle Paul has already argued in this book, who Christ is, namely that he is the creator of all things, and that by virtue of being the creator of all things, he is also therefore prototokos. He is preeminent over everything, and therefore even in the realm of apologetics, the Apostle Paul would argue here that Christ should be preeminent at any point when we encounter any philosophy, any worldview, any argument, or any religious or spiritual system that does not come from Christ. Now, and the reason we do that, of course, is because in this very passage, we are given something of a paradigm that we can run through when we're thinking about how do we approach the subject of Christian apologetics. Well, chapter 2, beginning in verse 1 and going all the way to verse 8, so important. But at the beginning of chapter 2 here in Colossians, the first thing that Paul says in verse 2 is that in Jesus Christ reside all of the treasures of wisdom and of knowledge, verses 2 and verses 3. And the whole purpose behind knowing that is that Paul wants us to have what he calls full assurance of understanding. That's verse 2. And so how do we arrive at full assurance of understanding? Well, to the degree that you understand, number one, that all the treasures of wisdom, how we reason, how we think, what is true, what is right morally, ethically, because in the biblical worldview, wisdom is not just dealing with the realm of philosophy, but it is inextricable, really, from the realm of morality. So biblical wisdom is godly wisdom, something to keep in mind very much then. There's no need for a sort of false bifurcation where it's either pertaining to morality or either pertaining to, let's say, to philosophy, reason, or epistemology. No, it's both. It's all. In the biblical worldview, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics all sort of, in a sense, sort of inform one another, interpenetrate, and rely upon each other. You cannot separate these things in the biblical worldview. They all go together, and they all come from Christ, and they're all known through Christ. So the Apostle Paul then moves on, gives us a real dire warning here. He says, look, don't let anybody delude you through persuasive argument. And remember, the time of the apostle here, as he was living in the Greco-Roman world, there was a tendency among the Greeks and among the philosophers of that time to engage in fanciful rhetorical sort of debate and fanciful oratory sort of presentations of a philosophy and whatnot. Athens and Mars Hill, key examples of that, where people sat around just digesting different philosophies. Whatever was new, they just kind of had itching ears, and they just lived to hear tell of some new thing, and they never grounded. Some new thing means they never ever achieved actually the truth, and that's why they always needed something new. But from the biblical perspective, the Apostle Paul says in verse 8, just to summarize the argument, in verse 8 he says, look, see that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit. Now, this is the real danger in the realm of Christian apologetics, in the realm of Christian theology, in the realm of philosophy. And that is that a Christian who is who is born again, who is filled with the Spirit of God, who has been regenerated by God, and who is intended to live his or her life under the supremacy of Jesus Christ, under the Word of God, under the Lordship of God, can, if they're not careful, be taken in by these sort of ungodly and unbiblical philosophies, what he calls here persuasive argument. And what he's hinting at there, this category, is a deception. It's a false philosophy, a philosophy that really is not true. It's not just that philosophy is bad in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with philosophy so long as that philosophy is what Paul says it should be, namely according to Christ. Because what's your option? Your option is that if your philosophy is not in accordance with Christ, that it will be in accordance with the traditions of men. That's what he says here, according to the tradition of man, according to the elementary principles of the world. Now, the elementary principles of the world is a fascinating statement. These are several English words, elementary principles of the world, really three words, right? Elementary, principles, and world, to try to capture what the Greek text is saying there. And the Greek word there is stoicheon. Stoicheon literally means something like man-made religion, man-made philosophy, man-made ethics, morals, and worldviews, whether it's spirituality, whether it's religion, whether it's philosophy, whatever the worldview is, if it's not according to Christ, what Paul would basically say is this, and this is so in keeping with the presuppositional method, that what you're given is essentially a great antithesis. And the antithesis is this: you either have thinking that stems from Christ, coheres to Christ, and results in the glory of Christ, or you have thinking that stems from the thinking of man, the traditions of man, the worthless elementary principles of human reason and worldly philosophy, unbiblical worldviews, and that ends up becoming sort of a frustrated, futile system of thinking. You can call it philosophy, you can call it whatever you want. If it doesn't adhere with the mind of Jesus Christ, if it doesn't adhere to Jesus, remarkably, the next verse, the Apostle Paul says, in him dwells all the fullness of deity in bodily form. And that sort of shows you why Jesus deserves the place as ultimate authority in the Christian worldview. You see, because the Christian worldview always operates on three simple principles: ultimate authority, epistemological self-consciousness, and then the last one is the antithesis, pushing the antithesis, that is. And so that means arguing by way of presupposition to show the unbeliever that his or her thinking, if it doesn't accord to Christ, will always end in futility.